In this lecture, we're going to look at the large intestine. So like the other lectures we've looked at so far, we'll start off by looking at the position of the large intestine within the abdomen and how that projects onto the surface of the skin. And then we'll go on to explore the gross anatomy. We'll look at features like the cecum and appendix and the various parts that form the colon. We'll look at the location and relations within the abdomen and explore appendicitis. We'll look at the wall structure of the colon and then diverticulosis. We'll also look at the neurovascular supply. The large intestine is really important in the process of digestion, and it is the main site for water reabsorption. It also plays an important part in storing the feces, as it receives the indigestible remnants of the chyme that's passed through the stomach and the small intestine. There it compacts and stores this material prior to defecation. So if we look at the surface anatomy of the large intestine, then we can see on our torso that we have this inverted U shape. We see we've got the ileocecal junction about here, where the distal portions of the ileum are continuous with the large intestine, and then inferior to that junction we find we have the cecum and the appendix attached. This is low in the right quadrant, or in the right inguinal region of the abdomen. The colon then passes upwards as the ascending colon as it heads towards the liver. The liver would be around about in this position, which we can see in this diagram. Here's the liver. And we've got what's known as the hepatic flexure, or what's called here the right colic flexure. Once it's got to the liver, it then takes a sharp 90-degree turn to the left, and it runs across the abdomen. It runs towards the spleen. And here we have what's known as the splenic flexure, or the left colic flexure. The colon then descends as the descending colon, and it passes towards the left inguinal region, where it's then continuous with the sigmoid colon that passes towards the midline. Here it is then continuous with the rectum, and that is where the majority of these feces are stored prior to defecation, as they then leave via the anal canal. And we'll explore that region later on in a separate lecture. So on this diagram, on the opposite side, we can see how this inverted U-shape large intestine actually fits within the large intestine. We can see we've got this U shape here, and within it, we can see the coils of jejunum and the coils of ileum, these being continuous from the duodenum, which is fed into from the stomach. So here we can see the basic cartoon outline of where the large intestine is orientated. Some key facts in regard to the large intestine. As I've mentioned a couple of times now, it's an inverted U shape, and it has an average length of about 1.5 to 2 meters. It's below the level of the stomach and the liver, and it surrounds the small intestine. It begins at the ileocecal junction, where the terminal ileum meets the large intestine, and it ends at the anus, which is within the pelvis. Parts of the large intestine can be found in all abdominal regions. So the large intestine, its inverted U shape, can be found in the vast majority of the abdominal regions. It consists, the large intestine, of a cecum and appendix, which we mentioned previously. Then it has 4 parts which constitute the colon: ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid. And then finally have the rectum, which is then continuous with the anal canal. And we'll look in detail at these parts in a subsequent lecture. The main functions of the large intestine are, like I said, to reabsorb water. So this dehydrates the stools. Also, it has a role in absorbing vitamins, and it's vital in the compaction and storage of feces. So let's go on to explore the anatomy of the large intestine. We'll see these diagrams before in relation to the small intestine, and once again we can see that we have the greater omentum, which is hanging from the transverse colon, which we can see here, and the greater omentum, this apron-like structure, is hanging from it. Removing the greater omentum reveals again parts of the jejunum and the ileum in this central region, and we can also now pick up the underside of the transverse colon here, and we can also see the ascending colon. So food is going to be travelling up this indigestible remnants of the ingested food is going to be passing up in this direction, then it will go across, ultimately descending down in this direction. So it's following that inverted U shape. If we move on to the second series of diagrams, which again we've seen before, this time we've mobilized the small intestine, which is possible because of the mesentery. And again, in this diagram here, we can see that we have this ascending colon. We can see the junction of the ileum and the large intestine here, the ileocecal junction. And we can also see that in this region below the ileocecal junction, we also have the cecum and then this blind pouch, the appendix. Again, the ascending colon, transverse colon. Over in this direction, the spleen would be positioned up here. So this is where we have the splenic flexure. And then the splenic flexure is the point where the colon starts to descend, and we have the descending colon running in this direction. We then have a piece of the colon that is mobilized. Like the small intestine, this piece of colon also has a mesentery, and here we can see we have the sigmoid colon. Just here, we have what's known as the sigmoid mesocolon. I'll explore these mesocolons and mesentery in more detail later on, but we can see the sigmoid colon here as a mesentery. It's then continuous with the rectum. Another part of the colon also has a mesentery attached to it, and that is the transverse colon here. And this membranous shelf, which we can see here when the transverse colon is elevated, is the transverse mesocolon. And these are the two parts of the large intestine that have a mesentery attached to them, the transverse colon and the transverse mesocolon, and the sigmoid colon and the sigmoid mesocolon. These give these regions greater mobility. The appendix attached to the cecum also has a small mesentery, the mesoappendix. But like I said, I'll explore these mesenteries in a later lecture. So here we've got a diagram of the large intestine, which has been removed from the abdomen. We're looking at it in isolation. Again, we can pick up the ileocecal junction, and then we can see food, the indigestible parts of the food, is going to be running in this direction. We can see now the various parts really clearly. Inferior to the ileocecal junction, we find we've got the cecum. Attached to the cecum, we find this blind-ended pouch, which is the appendix. And then above the ileocecal junction, we find the ascending colon. Remember, this is heading up towards the liver, so we have the right colic flexure, also known as the hepatic flexure, which we can see here. So the liver would be positioned around about in this direction. So there would be where the liver is. So we have the hepatic flexure. Then running transversely from right to left, we have the transverse colon heading towards the spleen. So here we have the spleen, and so that would be the splenic flexure. And that's where the transverse colon now runs down this left side. It descends down this left side of the abdomen as the descending colon. Descending colon continues with the sigmoid colon. So descending colon, we've got the sigmoid colon, which is continuous with the rectum. The sigmoid colon travels towards the midline. So starting in this left inguinal region, the sigmoid colon migrates via its sigmoid mesocolon, its mesentery. It passes to the midline, where it's then continuous with the rectum. On here, on this diagram, you can see there's a whole series of external features, and that's what we can explore in the next slide. This is just a small section of large intestine, specifically the colon, really, that we've removed, and we've opened up a window when we've reflected these flaps. Now, what we can see on the large intestine are features that make it distinguishable from the small intestine. Now, you should be able to notice the small intestine by its location, but sometimes throughout life, various things can happen and the position of the organs in the abdomen can become distorted. But here we can see there's a series of distinguishable features that make the large intestine stand out from the small intestine. We have what are known as tena coli. These tena coli here are bands of longitudinal muscle. When we looked at the small intestine, we saw that the longitudinal muscle that went in the same direction as the small intestine, was a complete band that went all the way around, a bit like my sleeve, completely covering the small intestine, running in this longitudinal direction. But for the large intestine, you only have 3 bands. It's an incomplete sleeve. You just have 3 bands that are going alongside the large intestine. And these are called tena coli. Now, because these contract, they create these pouches or haustra. And as these muscles contract, they help to shuffle the indigestible, the feces along the large intestine. And the constriction of these tena coli, these 3 bands of longitudinal muscle, create these pouches, which we know as haustra. We have 3 tena coli, 3 different types of tena coli, which we'll explore in the next slide. And here we can see we also have some mental appendices, or appendices epiplicae. And these are just fatty tags that are attached to the colon. You don't find them in the small intestine. They're just attached to the large intestine. These peritoneal sacs that are filled with fat. These are mental appendices. If we open up the large intestine, we can see that where we have these kind of pouches, the constrictions of these pouches on the inside leads us to what are known as semilunar folds. And that gives us the appearance internally of these ridges, where the tena coli, longitudinal bands of muscle, have in fact shortened the large intestine somewhat. We can see, if we return to the tena coli, that we have 3 types of tena coli. We have the tena coli, which is known as the omental tena, and this is the part that attaches to the greater omentum. So the greater omentum, hanging down from the transverse colon, will actually be attached to the omental tena. The mesocolic tena is where the transverse mesocolon attaches to. So the transverse mesocolon is coming up from the posterior abdominal wall in line with the pancreas, and it passes up towards the transverse colon, and it attaches to the transverse colon where this tena is, where this mesocolic tena is located, this specific band of longitudinal muscle. The greater omentum extends from the omental tena coli band, and then the final one is this free tena coli, which doesn't have any omenta or mesocolon attached to it. And here we can see we've got some details of what I just explained. We've got the 3 different bands of tena coli, the mesocolic, the omental, the free. We've got these longitudinal bands of muscles creating these haustra, these saculations, and internally creating these semilunar folds. And also I mentioned these small fatty tags, these omental appendices. Another clear way to distinguish the large intestine from the small intestine is its greater diameter. The greater diameter compared to that of the small intestine. So, apart from the obvious position of the small intestine, you should be able to work out where the large intestine is, and due to its inverted U shape around the lateral aspects of the abdomen, but also via these 3 clear, distinguishable features. So if we look at the individual parts of the large intestine, then here we've seen these diagrams before. We're looking at the cecum and the appendix. And here again we can see we've got the ileum. We can see the appendix here radiating away from the cecum. And this is a posterior view, as if you're looking at the cecum and appendix through my posterior abdominal wall. So we can see the ileum is radiating away to the left in this direction. And what we can see is radiating from the appendix are these 3 bands of longitudinal muscle. There we have the mesocolic tena, which attaches to the mesocolon, or the mesocolon attaches to this tena coli. We also have the omental tena coli, where the greater omentum is coming from this one. And then we have the free tena, which I mentioned previously, doesn't have anything attached to it. So we have these 3 bands of longitudinal muscle. And if this was a piece of small intestine, then obviously we'd have that complete layer. Here we can see we've got the cecum and the appendix again, but this time the cecum and the initial portion of the ascending colon has been opened up. So we can now see the opening of the ileum into the large intestine. We can see the cecum here. We've got a nice little opening for the appendix, which is this slender, blind-ended pouch. And then we've got this cecum, which is like this little bag, this little sac, and then we've got the ascending colon, which would pass up in this direction. The appendix is anchored via a mesoappendix. It's quite a small piece of mesentery, the mesoappendix. And the position of the appendix, as we can see in this diagram here, is incredibly variable. So we can see that even though we open up the right inguinal region, and we should be able to locate the appendix, it may actually need some rooting around to find it, because the tail of the appendix, the kind of tip, can project into numerous different directions. Here we see it lying posterior to the ileum. We see it lying anterior to the ileum here. Here we can see it poking kind of straight down as a continuation of the ascending colon. And here we can see it actually tucked underneath the cecum. So although it's there, it may need some rooting out. So if we just stick with the appendix for a little bit longer, then the function of the appendix is not really that well understood in the human. In the lower animals, it's important in being able to digest grass and various other aspects of digestion. But in the human, it's really a lymphoid tissue. It helps to produce white blood cells and part of the lymphatic system. Now, because it's a narrow, blind-ended pouch, it can actually become blocked. And if it becomes blocked by feces, then it can actually can swell and become inflamed. And that creates appendicitis if it was to become inflamed and it potentially become infected. Now, we mentioned this when we looked at the surface anatomy, but now we understand the anatomy of the appendix a bit more. We may be able to appreciate the position of the appendix in this right inguinal region. And again, we can locate the umbilicus, we can locate the anterior superior iliac spine, and then a line drawn between these 2 points, and then a line a third of the way from the anterior superior iliac spine to the umbilicus, so about here, is going to be what's known as McBurney's point. And that is the position of the appendix. So it can be very painful appendicitis, and the pain initially being felt in the midline, where you just have this dull ache. But with time, the pain can progress to this lower right quadrant in association with McBurney's point. If we look at the wall structure of the large intestine, then we can see we have this band of longitudinal muscle. But again, importantly, it really is just associated with a tene. We don't have that complete band of longitudinal muscle. Remember those 3 of those tenacoli. But we also have the circular layer, which is consistent around them. If we look at the structure of the large intestine, its wall, we see that it has a larger diameter than the small intestine, but the wall is actually thinner. The wall is actually a lot thinner than the small intestine. There's an absence of villi, so we don't have this big surface area, which is enhanced by the villi in the small intestine. This is indicative of the fact that it's not actually being that active in absorption. It's just absorbing some water and vitamins. Its main priority is to store feces and to allow for their defecation. And that's why we have these distinctive intestinal glands, which are located in the wall of the large intestine. And within these glands, there's an abundance of goblet cells, and these produce lots and lots and lots of mucus. Because the water is being drawn out from the feces, they can actually become quite dehydrated, quite dry. So we need to have some lubrication via this mucus to allow the feces to pass through the large intestine and ultimately be removed. This is a picture of an actual piece of large intestine, which has a series of little pouches, and these are unusual. What we can see on this diagram is we've got a tenacoli here, and we can actually make out some little pouches, which we can see here. some little bulging pouches, and these are called diverticuli. These little pouches are not normally occurring in the large intestine, but they're bulbing out from the wall of the large intestine. Now, diverticulosis is a series of these outpoachings along the wall of the colon, and they're usually found in the sigmoid colon. They're a result of changes in pressure with defecation. Now, what the likely cause of them is a lack of fibre within your diet. If you do not have a high level of fibre within your diet, then a lot of the water from the feces is absorbed. If you have some fibre in your diet which isn't really digested, that's going to hold on to the water and make your feces softer. Because you now have a high level of water in your feces, they can be easily removed because it's quite soft and the flow can be relatively smooth. If there's a lack of fibre, a lot of the water is removed, which makes the stools hard. For these to be defecated, for these to be removed, you have to increase intra-abdominal pressure to such an extent that you're physically forcing the feces away. They're not allowed to glide away. This can change the pressure within the large intestine and resulting in these little outpoachings occurring. If we have these outpoachings and then they become occluded, they can lead to infections and inflammation. And with this inflammation, you can have diverticulitis, where they become inflamed. If they end up bleeding, they can be quite painful, and then you can develop having blood in your stools. So diverticulosis leading to diverticulitis can be quite a serious condition. So if we look at the vasculature of the large intestine, we can see that the large intestine is really important. It's what is known as a watershed organ. It has a contribution from two main branches of the abdominal aorta. So we can see that the arterial supply to the large intestine comes from the superior and the inferior mesenteric arteries. Here we can see we have the superior mesenteric artery coming from about L1 from the abdominal aorta, and here we can see we have the inferior mesenteric artery coming from about L3. So superior mesenteric artery comes from L1, and the inferior mesenteric artery comes from about L3. We'll explore these in a bit more detail in a later session, a later lecture. Essentially, coming from these mesenteric arteries, your superior and your inferior mesenteric artery, are a series of colic arteries. Your ileocolic, which heads towards the ileocecal junction, your right colic, middle colic, left colic. And these all branch away, ileocolic, right colic, middle colic. And we'll see they're passing away from their respective stem, the superior mesenteric artery in this case, or the left colic artery here from the inferior mesenteric artery. We have sigmoid arteries coming down towards the sigmoid colon. These are spreading out and fanning out towards the transverse, ascending, transverse, descending and sigmoid parts of the large intestine. We can see here we have a very important anastomosis. We have a continuation of the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery. So blood will be coming in this direction from the superior mesenteric artery, and blood will be coming in this direction from the inferior mesenteric artery. So what we have is this region around here in this upper left quadrant by the spleen. We have a transition where this region is supplied by both the superior and the inferior mesenteric artery. And this is really important. It forms what's known as the marginal artery, which runs around this aspect, this upper left quadrant by the spleen of the large intestine. And it's important if the inferior mesenteric artery was to be occluded. So we can imagine that if the inferior mesenteric artery was occluded due to atherosclerosis in the region near the inferior mesenteric artery, then blood wouldn't be able to pass towards this descending sigmoid parts of the colon. However, the presence of this marginal artery means that blood can actually route itself around in this direction, via the superior mesenteric artery, via the middle colic artery, and then being continuous with branches of the left colic. So there wouldn't be any serious deficit if there was a block. We'll explore this in later lectures in a bit more detail. If we look at the nerve supply again, then the nerve supply to this region again is a little bit complicated because it forms this transition between the superior mesenteric plexus and the inferior mesenteric plexus, and these are supplying different regions of the large intestine. Now, we'll really concentrate on this when we move on to lecture 20 at the end of the course, which really focuses on the autonomic nervous system. But for now, we can appreciate that for the large intestine, the parasympathetic input is going to increase activity. It's going to increase the activity just like the parasympathetic input increased the activity of the other GI organs. And the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system is going to decrease activity. And here we can see it's being carried out by a whole number of plexuses, the superior and the inferior mesenteric plexus. The main parasympathetic input is via the pelvic splanchnic nerves. This is primarily for this kind of distal portion of the large intestine. There's still some vagal input into the more proximal regions of the large intestine. But like I said, we'll explore this in more detail in a later lecture. So in conclusion, we've looked at the position of the large intestine, we've kind of mirrored it onto the wall of the abdomen, looked at the surface anatomy, and then we've explored the gross anatomy of the large intestine, looking at the cecum and appendix, and then we spoke about appendicitis briefly. Relations of the large intestine to other abdominal organs, we've looked at the wall structure and diverticulosis and how that can lead to diverticulitis. We then briefly, towards the end, looked at the arterial supply to the large intestine and how the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries and the formation of the marginal artery contribute to its blood supply. And then briefly again at the end, we looked at the autonomic control of the large intestine.